If you've been sewing or making your own patterns for a while, you may have heard about cutting on the bias or bias dresses, and you might be wondering what all the fuss is about. Well, in this video, we'll talk about the pros and the cons of cutting on the bias and whether it's worth it. Hi, welcome to Pattern Making with Lee. What makes cutting on the bias so incredible is also its downfall. But before we get into the pros and the cons, let's cover what the bias is.
To put it simply, there is a warp yarn which runs parallel to the fabric edge, known as a selvage. Then there is the weft yarn, which runs perpendicular, so at a 90-degree angle to the fabric edge.
In sewing, instead of saying direction, we say grain.
The direction of the warp yarn is known as the lengthwise or straight grain. Direction of the weft yarn is known as the crosswise grain.
That's pretty easy to remember. Lengthwise grain runs along the length, crosswise grain goes across it, and anything in between, so on the diagonal, is called the bias.
When we say bias, we are usually referring to the true bias, which is at a 45-degree angle to the warp and weft yarn, and each woven fabric has two true biases.
If you're a bit confused about all these terms and don't know what they all are, don't worry, I was getting confused too. I forgot there were so many what they all were, so I made a video about it, which you can watch. So we just covered grains, which are on your fabric. Now let's talk about grain lines, which are on your pattern.
Each sewing pattern should be cut so the grain line is parallel to the selvage, because the grain line marks the direction of the lengthwise grain.
Most patterns are cut with the lengthwise grain running down the pattern. The lengthwise grain is the strongest grain and the most stable, and we don't want our patterns to our fabric to lengthen and for the hem to drop.
However, you can rotate the grain line 45 degrees so that the pattern is cut diagonally on the true bias.
So, instead of having the lengthwise grain run down the pattern or body, which happens 90% of the time, the bias grain is running down the pattern and body and across it. Because remember, there are two true bias grains.
When you cut the pattern, you still line the grain line up so it's parallel to the selvage, but the pattern is now diagonal.
Clothes cut on the bias are malleable. Because the bias grain is running across the body and down it, they can stretch the mold over the body. They also fall beautifully and drape well.
This is the lengthwise grain, this is the crosswise grain, and this is the bias grain. See how much more the bias grain stretches?
This means clothes cut on the bias feel nicer to wear because they're not constricting you, they have this natural ease in them. They're also a wrinkle less and they're more flattering because they skim over the body. How much give or stretch does depend on the fabric though.
Cutting on the bias works best in lightweight to medium fabrics like silk satin, rayon viscose, chiffon, crepe, georgette, and lightweight linen.
These fabrics drape well and have a natural fluidity to them, so while it is cutting on the bias, it's also the type of fabric that you use
that gives the fluid, beautiful, sexy, drapey quality of body skimming bias cut dresses.
So, cutting on the bias looks great and it feels amazing, but these fabrics are also more expensive, which brings me to the cons. Silk satins, crepes, and chiffons are often your more expensive fabrics.
And cutting on the bias isn't the most efficient way to cut fabrics. This is the shirt front on the lengthwise grain and on the bias grain.
So you need more fabric than cutting on the straight grain. The fabric's more expensive. Plus, these expensive fabrics, well, they're often on smaller rolls.
Usually, silks are 112 to 137 centimeter rolls, so 44 to 54 inches, while cottons are 137 to 152 centimeters, so 54 to 60 inches wide.
It may not seem like much, but it does add up. And you need a fair bit more fabric, plus having a smaller roll, well, it affects the pattern too.
Have you ever noticed these weird style lines on the bottom of some evening dresses? That's because the long evening dresses are cut on the bias don't fit on the standard silk rolls, so you need to add a corner.
Plus, silks and other delicate lightweight fabrics, well, they're quite difficult to sew, and you put on the bias, well, the bias stretches, so all your skims are going to be on the bias, which makes them harder to sew.
Madeleine Vionnet is credited with being the first designer to use bias cutting technique, and even her dresses, which are probably painstakingly sewn by hand, couldn't always avoid puckering along the seams. Also, to be fair, these were made about a century ago, and fabric does drop with time.
I will be doing a whole series on how to sew bias dresses and how to prevent puckering and stretching along the seams, but for now, just remember that it involves a whole lot of love to sew bias dresses well. And it's not just the stretching along the seams, because the bias grain runs along the length, the hem will drop too, which means you need to trim the hem before you finish it. So you need to leave it on a mannequin for 24 hours, let the hem drop, trim it to the correct length, and then finish it. feel like I listed so many cons there, and because fabric consumption is so high, the fabric you use is so expensive, and it's so much harder to sew, commercially in the industry, it's only really viable to make bias cut dresses for evening wear.
But I'm still sold on the dream, and the best part of having the skills to make your own clothes is you can spoil yourself and make beautiful things for you.
If you're still sold on the dream, subscribe to my channel and click on the notifications bell so you don't miss the next video in my bias series. I'm going to show you how to change patterns that are cut in the straight grain to the bias. I'll also do a video with 7 tips on making patterns that are cut in the bias. We'll talk about how to prevent puckering, where to put design features, and do a bit of myth busting. Often bias dresses remove the darts, but should you, and can you get rid of closures, and how much smaller should the pattern be?